Welcome to everyone who's tuned in to join us. Now, it may be early morning or early evening, depending on which part of the world that you happen to find yourself in today. And my name's Xavier Simmons. I'm director of the Plunkett Centre for Ethics, and we are a joint initiative of the Australian Catholic University and several partner organisations in the health and aged care sector, including St Vincent's Health Australia, Calvary, Cabrini, and Mercy Health. And it's my great pleasure to be your moderator today and to also be introducing today's speaker. I'd first like to acknowledge our co-hosts for this event who have assisted us with promotion and are a very valued collaborator at the De Nicola Centre for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. I'm very grateful to Justin Petrisek, Research and Publications Programs Manager at the CEC, for his assistance in organising this event. And we hope this will be the first of many collaborations with the CEC, given all the great work that they do. In today's event, we'll hear from Professor Tyler J. VanderWeele about his book, A Theology of Health, Wholeness and Human Flourishing, which was published with the University of Notre Dame Press in 2024. Professor VanderWeele will speak first, and we'll hopefully have quite a few minutes for questions at the end of his presentation. Before handing the floor to Tyler, I'll just provide a very brief introduction. Professor Tyler VanderWeele is the John L. Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology in the Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and Director of the Human Flourishing Program and co-director of the Initiative on Health, Spirituality and Religion at Harvard University. He holds degrees from the University of Oxford, the University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard University in mathematics, philosophy, theology, finance, and biostatistics. His methodological research is focused on theory and methods for distinguishing between association and causation in the biomedical and social sciences, and more recently, on psychosocial measurement theory. His empirical research spans psychiatric and social epidemiology, the science of happiness and flourishing, and the study of religion and health. He is the recipient of the 2017 President's Award from the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies. Dr. VanderWeele has published over 500 papers in peer-reviewed journals. He's the author of the books Explanation in Causal Inference, Modern Epidemiology, Measuring Wellbeing, The Handbook of Religion and Health, and most recently, A Theology of Health. He writes a monthly blog posting on topics related to human flourishing for Psychology Today. So without further ado, I'll hand the floor to Professor Tyler VanderWeele to present to us today. Thanks very much, Tyler.
Oh, thank you, Xavier, and really a pleasure being with you all here today. I will be providing a brief overview of my recent book, Theology of Health. I'll talk a little bit about the motivation for it and the structure of the book, and then spend some time giving an overview of its contents, but hope to have some time for discussion, questions, and so on towards the end. If you're interested in a copy of this after the presentation, it is available through University of Notre Dame Press or via Amazon. You can also download a copy of the PDF for free from Project Muse. In terms of the motivation for the book, and in some sense it was twofold. First, I had been teaching for a number of years a course on religion, well-being, and public health at the Harvard School of Public Health, focused more on the empirical research on religion and health, and the role that religious communities play either in providing health services or often just in improving the health of the congregants or parishioners. Dramatically lower rates of suicide, lower rates of depression, lower risk of mortality over 15 years. And as I was pondering this work and these results, and thinking about their relation to Christian understandings of health, of wholeness, of well-being. Certainly, community is central to the Christian faith, but I came to think, that there's more that perhaps the Christian faith has to say about health than simply the importance of community. What are we to make of the fact, for example, that when we read in the Gospels, Jesus saying, your faith has healed you. The Greek literally is your faith has saved you. What is that relation between healing and salvation? What is the role of love in health? Why don't we talk about love more in public health? It is so central to the Christian faith. What about sin? What about forgiveness? And so some of these considerations led to a desire to write this book. I think a second set of considerations was simply seeing how much more there had been written on Christian perspectives in medicine versus Christian perspectives in public health, or the nature of health. There's a large literature on what, from a Christian perspective, does it mean to be a good clinician? And I think that really is wonderful, beautiful, inspirational writing, and I think can help guide the practice of medicine, but really had difficulty locating something similar for public health. And so in thinking through what might be needed for Christian community and understanding health and trying to promote health and trying to engage with public health, I decided a number of years ago that taking on this project might be important, and so spent a fair bit of time on my last sabbatical trying to get a draft of this out, but it has benefited from many readers of earlier drafts of the manuscript, and certainly the work both of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard and the Initiative on Health, Spirituality, and Religion, which Xavier Simons so helpfully led and coordinated while he was with us at Harvard. So what I'll be presenting to you is sort of the result of those reflections over those years. The structure of the book is three parts. And each of those parts has sort of a central proposition and then several sub-propositions and then kind of an exposition of those various sub-propositions. So it's intended in a way to be able to kind of locate where there might be agreement or disagreement on these various aspects of the book. Each of these three parts also concludes with a section on what I see as the implications of this theology of health for the practice of medicine, of public health, and of society more broadly. The book concludes with a non-theological postscript, where in some sense I try to extract from both the theological material, but especially from the implications sections, those insights which may have arisen principally from a Christian understanding of the nature of health, but I think are of relevance in a pluralistic context and society. So for those who do not share perspectives of the Christian faith, it provides both a summary of the book, but I think also the parts that may be most relevant to the practice of public health and medicine in a secular or pluralistic society. But the book itself does take a confessionally Christian perspective on this topic of what is the nature of health. And so part one of the book, Health and Wholeness, central proposition there, and I'll spend some time going through each of these propositions and some of the sub-propositions and what follows, but then we'll spend about half of the time on the implications. But the first central proposition is health is wholeness as intended by God. Part two of the book is on ill health and sin. The central proposition there is the cause of ill health is sin, not necessarily one's own sin, but sin understood more generally, in a cosmic sense, in the interrelatedness of human community. So again, I'll spend some time going through that as well. And then the third part of the book, Healing and Salvation, central proposition there, the restoration and fulfillment of health is salvation. So again, I'll spend a fair bit of time going through each of these and some of the sub-propositions in the book, and then we'll move on to implications. But in many ways, the whole of the book could be summarized by the opening of Augustine's Confessions. Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord. Health is wholeness as intended by God. Our heart is restless. The cause of ill health is sin, until it finds its rest in thee. The restoration and fulfillment of health is salvation. Made us for thyself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in thee. So I will try to unpack now each of these three propositions. First, health is wholeness as intended by God. So a theme really running throughout the book is that our concept of health is really twofold. While it pertains to wholeness, when we think about the health of the human person and health in our ordinary language, we really have two conceptions of health: either the health of the body or the health of the person. And there's a large philosophical literature on what is health, and a lot of debate over what health is and how expansive the concept is. The World Health Organization's definition of health as a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being. And many criticize that definition as being too broad and as being too difficult for medicine or public health to address. So some prefer a much narrower conception of health. But then others will argue that those narrow conceptions are too narrow. And when we're thinking about health or even speaking of health, we often have something broader in view. And so the position articulated in the book is, in fact, we have two concepts of health: the health of the body. Essentially, the body's systems and parts are intact to enable the functions characteristic of the human person. So it's the health of the body. And the health of the person, that essentially all aspects of the person's life are good, that the person is whole, that the person is in fact flourishing. And we see, I think, both uses of health in our ordinary language. We might say, oh, he's physically healthy, but he's not a healthy person. He spends all of his time socially isolated. So there we have both the health of the body and the health of the person in the same sentence. So the position the book takes is that rather than debating where on the spectrum is health located, from narrow versus to expansive conceptions, and that many of our disputes could in fact be resolved by clarifying in each given context whether what we have in view is the health of the body or the health of the person. Another proposition put forward in this first part of the book is that health of the person consists of complete physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being. So, as noted earlier, the definition of health, World Health Organization, 1946, still in place today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And as I said before, that definition has often been criticized as being too broad, too difficult for medicine to address. But I would say from a Christian perspective, if we're thinking about not the health of the body, but the health of the person, then in fact the WHO definition is not too broad, but too narrow. It includes spiritual well-being as well, and really from a Christian understanding, that is what is most central to the health of the person, to the flourishing of the person. And there's in fact been a long history of attempts to include spiritual well-being in the World Health Organization's definition of health, all of which have ultimately failed, and the World Health Organization's been resistant to alter its definition, perhaps in part for good reason. As soon as they do so, probably open the door for all sorts of other proposed modifications. But again, I think from a Christian perspective and from the perspective of many of the world religions, spiritual well-being really is central to the health of the person, central to flourishing. And so we've sometimes referred to this broader understanding of the health of the person as physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being as the WHO plus definition of health, to acknowledge what the original definition is, but to say really what we should be aiming at from the perspective of the Christian faith and from many of the world religions is spiritual well-being also. From a Christian perspective, if we're thinking about the health of the person, then the complete person, body and soul, was created good by God as an integrated whole, and really, health again is wholeness as intended by God, either of the body or of the person. But the human person is a whole. What happens to one aspect of the person will affect what happens to other parts of the person's life, and there's large empirical literature on this as well. It's become increasingly clear that a sense of purpose in life, in fact, affects our physical health, social connection, social support, loneliness, likewise affect physical health, and of course, physical health itself can enable the pursuit of our goals and purposes, or enable social relationships. So, flourishing is understood as the health of the person, is really all aspects of a person's life are good. That flourishing, that health of the person really is multi-dimensional. And often at the work of the Human Flourishing Program, we look at various aspects of the health of the person, of flourishing, which I think have relatively universal consent, things like happiness and physical bodily health and meaning, to be a good person, character, social relationships. And I think each of these is part of what we mean by the health of the person. But really that health of the person is understood as an integrated whole. All aspects of a person's life are good: complete physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being. If flourishing is understood as all aspects of a person's life are good, then that includes the well-being of a community, that the person's community is doing well, is flourishing also. In some sense, the well-being of the community is part of an individual's own flourishing, and that's in part because the community shapes the well-being of individuals, but also because of the individual's participation in the common good of the community. So while we'll often use kind of flourishing and well-being interchangeably in much of our work, when we do try to distinguish between the two, we'll say well-being is to attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good as they pertain to that individual, whereas flourishing is all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context, communities, environments in which that person lives. So the community's well-being is part of one's own flourishing, and I think we find that notion reflected in scriptures and the teachings of the church as the body of Christ. When one part suffers, the whole suffers as well. But community's well-being is part of one's own flourishing. And then final proposition I'll comment on here from the book is that complete health of the person includes communion with God. And again, from a Christian perspective, this really is what is most central to our understanding of well-being. Often that pursuit of God, that pursuit of communion with God, is consonant with other aspects of flourishing, as I noted earlier in the empirical research, in many contexts contributes to physical health and mental health and meaning and relationships, but that can come into conflict. One's service of God or seeking God, when trying to fulfill one's calling, may require sacrifice, may require working in very difficult circumstances, a sacrifice of physical health or a sense of happiness in some cases in this life. And so from a Christian perspective, though, when there are conflicts, it is that communion with God that is to be prioritized. Okay, perhaps slightly more briefly, the cause of ill health is sin as part 2. And again, the claim's not that there's a one-to-one correlation between one's wrongdoing and one's state of health, either of the body or of the person. Rather that, from a Christian perspective, the notion of wrongdoing taken collectively is what has given rise to ill health, has given rise to lack of wholeness, and in some sense, understood from a Christian perspective, if sin is interpreted as a deviation from God's intent, then almost by definition, any sin, any deviation from God's intent is a deviation from wholeness, is a lack of wholeness, is ill health. But we see this, fairly clearly in other contexts as well. Actual instances of ill health often do follow from the wrongful actions of ourselves or others. Violence or emotional or sexual abuse does harm to those who experience those wrongs. So although we don't talk about sin or even wrongdoing very often in public health, we do talk about violence, we do talk about discrimination, we do talk about rape, and these are wrongful actions. These are wrongful actions leading to the ill health of others. Moreover, those wrongful actions can bring about unjust structures that may result in ill health over extended periods of time, and even across generations. And this, again, I think, is a phenomena that the public health community acknowledges and takes very seriously, and rightly so. And those unjust structures can be maintained even without additional further wrongdoing, if efforts aren't made to address them and to address the structural disadvantages that many people face. And so this is another way in which that wrongful action, even of the past, can lead to ill health of the present. From a more distinctively Christian perspective, human nature is itself distorted by sin, distorted by wrongdoing, and this is understood differently in different parts of the Christian tradition. But the very fact that our desires will sometimes conflict with our reason or our will, what we think is best, all things considered, is itself a state of personal division, not something that is good. And I think the Christian understanding it is that sin, that deviation from God's intent for wholeness that has led to that disruption, that distortion of human nature that we now not infrequently experience. Sin has brought about and continues to bring about death, and again, this too I think is understood differently in Christian authors in different parts of the Christian tradition, but we can certainly see this descriptively and causally through acts of violence bringing about death, but also perhaps in a deeper way that perhaps the phenomena of death itself is a result of sin, as a result of the distorted human nature, as perhaps a departure from an original state of grace, a state of original justice that God intended, and that it brings about a sort of spiritual death as well. That deviation from God's intent, from wholeness, separates us from God. Then ill health cannot be entirely prevented without also addressing sin. If sin is the cause of ill health, then we really can't address ill health without thinking about human wrongdoing, without thinking about sin. And again, this may be more uncomfortable within the context of public health thinking, but in some ways is acknowledged. Yes, we need to address violence, discrimination, injustice to address health. And I think the Christian perspective is that is yet broader, and that pertains to our spiritual health and well-being also. And then finally, the experience of distress over brokenness, over that lack of wholeness that we sometimes experience is what suffering is. It's that experience of our brokenness, of our lack of wholeness. That is suffering. But that also makes clear our need for healing and restoration. Brings the third part of the book, restoration and fulfillment of health is salvation. I think from the Christian perspective, the principal way that restoration and fulfillment of wholeness, of God's intent are brought about are by love of God, love of neighbor, sometimes described as charity, a friendship with God, that reciprocal love between us and God, enabled by God's love of us, but thereby empowering us to love God, to love others, to have that restored relationship, to address sin and wrongdoing, to return us to love of neighbor, love of all of those around us, thereby healing broken relationships, providing for the needs of others, and guiding others to a greater spiritual wholeness. From Christian understanding, God has brought about that healing and salvation through the life, the death, the resurrection, ascension of Jesus Christ. And again, this is understood differently in different parts of the Christian tradition, but that in Jesus's death on the cross, Jesus took our sin upon himself in some way and did away with it. And in his resurrection gives us the possibility of new life, and in his sending of his Spirit enables that new life, enables that restoration. As we live out that life now, that seeking of healing and restoration, that is done from a Christian perspective through the church. The church and its members are both agents, but also recipients of healing, healed by God through Jesus Christ, but then agents of that healing, bringing that healing, that love to the world, and that healing comes about here and now through communal life, through forgiveness, through prayer, through fasting, through the sacraments, through our growth in character, through the care of others, the loving of others, including the work of medicine. And so we try to bring about that healing, that restoration, the wholeness as God intended through the work and life of the church. But that there are limits in this life. All do still eventually die, and many, despite our best efforts, do still suffer. And so from Christian perspective, a belief that fulfillment of wholeness, that communion with that God, that completion of God's intent, will only come finally in the resurrection of the life to come, to itself be accomplished by God. But we will be restored, and more than restored. God's intent will not just be restored, but fulfilled. God's grace completes our nature, and we expect a fuller health, a fuller wholeness of the body in the resurrection, and of the person in communion with God in the life to come. Okay, so I'll move on and spend 15 minutes or so now discussing what I see as the implications of these more theological propositions. So first, again, I think in discussions of health, greater clarity is needed around whether the topic that we intend is the health of the body or the health of the person. And I think a lot of the disagreements could be resolved if we were simply to acknowledge that we have two different concepts and clarify what we're talking about in any given context. And I think that sort of perspective helps to perhaps locate what the proper purview of of medicine is. A lot of the objections to the World Health Organization's definition of health is that it's too broad for medicine to address. And I agree with that. I mean, the medicine's not intended to address all aspects of human flourishing. The physician is not interchangeable with a career counselor or a marital counselor or a pastor or a priest. Different caring professions have different roles, and yet to say that the physician only cares about the health of the body, I think is too narrow. Because decisions about the health of the body affect the person's flourishing more broadly. And so the proposal, this book, and I have an article on this as well, to send around if interested, is that, to my mind, I'm happy to take pushback here, or objections or critiques, that the proper purview of medicine is the health of the body, yes, but also those aspects of the health of the person, those aspects of the person's flourishing, including meaning and character and relationships and so on, aspects of the person's flourishing that pertain to decisions about the health of the body. So when one is trying to make a decision about different medical interventions, one needs to think about not just the effect on the body, but also on the person. So the clinician's not responsible for all aspects of a person's flourishing, but whatever decision comes up which will affect a person's flourishing, that does need to be taken into account as well. My perspective, the purview of psychiatry is even broader. And what's proposed in the book, and also a corresponding article, is that purview of psychiatry is the wholeness of the mind as it pertains to the proper functioning of the brain. So the wholeness of the mind as it pertains to the health of the body, and also those aspects of flourishing that the patient and clinician together agree to address through dialogue. So I think in principle, purview of psychiatry could be all aspects of the person's flourishing, but I think there also needs to be acknowledgement that how that's understood may vary across individuals and cultures and traditions, and so there should be some clarity between the psychiatrist and the patient with regard to how much do they want to take on together of the patient's flourishing. So this allows for variation across practices and even across patients in principle. Likewise, the proposal here is the purview of counseling consists of those aspects of flourishing that the patient and counselor together agree to address through dialogue. But again, I do think we need to acknowledge that there will be different understandings of flourishing, of the good life within society and across cultures, and this is especially important in the context of a pluralistic or secular society. So for some, including Christian, spiritual well-being is central. For others, it may not be. And so I think this opens the door, to my mind, and in a pluralistic context, for potentially tradition-specific practices of medicine and psychiatry. A lot of work would need to be done to get there from where we are today. But one could envision distinctively Christian or Buddhist or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu practices of medicine, of psychiatry, of counseling, taking into account better these more ultimate or spiritual aims, perhaps all relying on a common scientific knowledge base, but providing different forms of care based on that understanding of what the health of the person really looks like in its totality. My colleagues Michael and Tracy Balboni have written a whole book on this, From Hostility to Hospitality, also arguing that some of this may in fact be important to preserve the practice of medicine from the various pressures it's under at present, from bureaucratization or over focus on the economics or the technological aspects of medicine. A weaving together of tradition-specific practices incorporating spirituality may be quite critical. And one can see this in certain contexts already taking place. My understanding is in many contexts in China, one has the option of either more traditional medicine or more Western or scientific medical practices. And again, one could imagine systems whereby these tradition-specific practices of medicine are more widely on offer. It's also proposed in the book, and again, I think this doesn't require a distinctively Christian perspective in any sense, but that the purview of public health and public policy ought to be those aspects of the health of persons, those aspects of human flourishing, around which consensus can be attained in that particular society or context. I think much of our thinking and work in public health is focused either on physical health or on economic and financial considerations. And these are important, but I think we can have consensus around more than that. I think just about everyone desires to be happy, desires to have a sense of meaning and purpose in life, desires to be a good person, desires to have good social relationships, desires to have some financial security as well. And so I think, and then this is some of what the work of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard is trying to do, is to broaden our understanding of what that consensus is, not just physical health and economic considerations, but also happiness, meaning, relationships, character. And I think to the extent to which consensus can be attained around these things, it's reasonable for public health and public policy to try to promote these as well. And consequently, I think in medical context, public health context, public policy context, we should be assessing human well-being more holistically, not just looking at physical health and financial circumstances. And our flourishing measure looks at 6 different domains, Human Flourishing Program: happiness, health, meaning, character, relationships, and financial security. And I think we should be beginning to do these assessments routinely in our thinking in medicine, public health, and public policy. And ultimately, I think an exclusive focus on the health of the body, whether that's in the context of medicine or public health or public policy, will lead to poor decision-making. And I think this pertains even to medical practice. Again, I would argue the purview of medicine is not just the health of the body, but also those aspects of the health of the person affected by decisions about the health of the body. I had a surgeon come to me not long ago who said, "Tyler, I know from our randomized trials that our surgical interventions increase the years of disease-free survival. There's no question there. But," he said, "I'll have patients come to me 6 months later saying they want to die because the side effects have been so bad." And again, I think this is an instance where if we focus solely on the health of the body and don't think about whether a person can continue their work, their relationship, sexual function, so on and so forth, we're not going to make good decisions. I think these sorts of flourishing measures should be embedded in randomized trials of medical interventions as secondary outcomes to be able to assess the effects not just on the body, but on the person as well. In contrast, psychological theories of well-being, which I think are often somewhat more expansive, still are often quite not what we want. They're often impoverished by absence of considerations of bodily health because they're overly focused on the mind, but also often without any understanding of character or virtue or community well-being. And I think all of these are other important aspects of flourishing. So we need to enrich psychological theories of well-being with bodily health, with character, with notions of communal well-being also. On that point of communal well-being, I think since the health of persons includes their social well-being, assessments of social and community well-being should be made in public health and public policy contexts, and we should take these into account in our decision-making. This is becoming more prominent. A couple of years ago, the U.S. Surgeon General released a advisory on loneliness and social connection as a public health crisis. The UK has a minister of loneliness. And I think these are important steps to acknowledge that social connectedness, that social well-being is part of our own flourishing. So we should measure and we should take this into account in our thinking. Likewise, since the health of persons, since the flourishing of persons includes their spiritual well-being, I think attention should be given to tradition-specific understandings and assessments of spiritual well-being in discussions of public health, medicine, and public policy. There are fairly generic measures of spiritual well-being out there, but I think they are not fully adequate. I think how spiritual well-being is understood in the Christian tradition versus Buddhist, Islam, or Hindu, or Jewish traditions are different. And so I think to understand and study spiritual well-being, well, we do need tradition-specific measures. And I think it's reasonable, and this be more controversial, but even in a pluralistic society, to make assessments of tradition-specific spiritual well-being to see how different communities see themselves as progressing or not towards those ends which they seem as most important. If this is what is most valued by large portions of the population, then certainly this should be taken into account in public policy. So the point here is not to try to compare spiritual well-being across different traditions. If the measures are different, we really can't do so, but really to allow communities and to allow us as a society, allow a society to assess whether large groups of people see themselves as making progress towards those ends that they consider most important. And then these implications for part one is that because health of the body and health of the person are ideals, health in both senses are a relative concept. We never attain this perfectly, and health of the person flourishing is multidimensional. And so we may be doing well in some areas and not in others, but we never in this life attain perfect health of the body or perfect health of the person. But even in the absence of bodily health, we can promote flourishing, the health of the person in various ways, and should. Okay, more briefly, implications of cause of ill health is sin. I think human wrongdoing should not be overlooked as a cause of ill health. And again, this is done at least partially by talking about violence, discrimination, injustice as causes of ill health, but I do think the broader category is human wrongdoing, are deciding to do what is wrong and pointing that out, making the case not just on the grounds of health but on moral grounds, and as a result, I think we need to promote health. I think we need an emphasis on character promotion, on what constitutes good character, and an orientation towards seeking the good for others and for ourselves. So character, I think, ought to be emphasized in a way that in many contexts it is not as important in maintaining health. Injustices, the social nature of wrongdoing, and unjust structures of the past, I think, also need to be addressed in order to maintain health. Again, I'd say the public health community is somewhat better at trying to think through these issues, but they will continue to plague us, and we need to work towards thinking about what those structures are, what might we do to address them, and to enable those who have more disadvantaged backgrounds and situations to flourish as well. And more controversially within the context of the public health community, but I think to my mind clear from a Christian perspective, respect for life, and consequently the averting of abortion and euthanasia is critical to maintaining health. Health itself is contingent on life, and so if we are to promote health, we need to have a deep respect for life as a gift from God. And I think the work of the church is not just to try to avert abortion and euthanasia, but to help address the circumstances that give rise to desire for the termination of life, the concerns of mothers, whether that's financial or social, or regards employment, to work through those difficulties in ways that do respect life. Care for the environment is also critical to maintaining health, and there's a large research literature on this, but numerous theological calls for the importance of care for the environment, both for maintaining human health, but also for as a good in and of itself. Flourishing is state of all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context, communities, environments in which they live in. The health of our environment is also part of our flourishing. Next, the notion that we'll ultimately overcome ill health and death in this life is a fiction that we should resist, and one occasionally finds, ambitions for extending human life expectancy indefinitely. To what extent might we attain mortality? Again, I think from a Christian perspective, that is a fiction. Health is a relative concept. We are always experiencing ill health at some level, and we will inevitably face death. And I think taking that into account can actually help promote the health of the person, not just bodily health, but the health of the person, resources allocated accordingly, and to approach and think about our death in a way that appreciates and acknowledges the fullness of the person, that takes into account matters of meaning, of relationships and their conclusion, of the growth, the personal growth that can come about as one is approaching death. Xavier and I have a paper, and others on flourishing at the end of life, where we try to put forward an argument for these sorts of considerations. Next, medicine, public health, and public policy should be attentive to questions of suffering and not just mental disorders and physical diseases. If there is in caregiving a concern for the human person, not just the human body, but the human person, then we need to take into account the experiences, that experience of suffering, that experience of brokenness, to understand the patient's situation, the implications of a disease for the rest of their life as well. And I think could do a better job of this in medicine and perhaps even in public health as well. And there's resistance within the medical community. The Journal of the American Medical Association really won't even allow the word suffering in its text. One can suffer a disease, but in terms of suffering, it's not something they want to deal with. But I think if the purview of medicine is the care of the body and all aspects of the health of the person, of flourishing, that pertain to decisions about the health of the body, then we need to think about suffering as well. And then finally, medicine, public health, and public policy should be attentive to and address the phenomena of moral injury. There's some increasingly large scientific literature on this notion of moral injury, that some action or experience may threaten or disrupt one's understanding or intuitions about right and wrong and good and evil, or the goodness of institutions or oneself or others, and that this has powerful physical and mental health manifestations that are really quite different from PTSD, for example, but really are moral in nature, that concern wrongdoing. And I think that understanding of the cause of ill health is sin helps highlight the importance of moral injury and the need to be attentive to it. Okay, and then been going on a little long, so I'll try to move through this a bit more quickly. But implications of the third part of the book, healing and salvation. Restoration and fulfillment of health is salvation. First, I think medicine and public health need greater attention to psychological, social, and spiritual pathways to health and healing. Again, increasingly large and rigorous empirical literature suggesting that things like purpose in life, or social connectedness, or religious service attendance lead to better physical health. And we need to make use of these pathways and promote these pathways as well. I think institutions of public health and medicine should partner with religious communities to promote health and healing. And there's a large empirical literature on this as well. But while sometimes there can be conflicts, I think there are a lot of shared ends between religious communities and the public health community, and there should be a partnership to promote those ends of health and healing. Perhaps more controversially, within the context of medicine and public health, I think it's not, given the powerful effects of participation in religious community on health and well-being outcomes, I think it's not unreasonable that even in the context of medicine, that for those who already positively self-identify with a religious tradition, that participation in religious communities could be promoted. If someone already embraces a particular tradition, then encourage community participation in that religious tradition. The effects of health and healing are profound. One does have to be, careful about power dynamics and what is and is not ethical. We have a commentary in the American Journal of Epidemiology on this, trying to navigate this in a reasonable, ethical manner. But in many ways, I think given the empirical literature on this, that in some contexts, that promotion of participation in religious communities is reasonable. And for those who are not religious, I think other forms of community participation should be supported and encouraged. The empirical literature on this is very, very strong by this point in time. Next, character development should be promoted at local, national, international scales to foster health and healing. And there's large empirical literature on at least a handful of character interventions like gratitude or acts of kindness or perseverance or compassion that have been successful in randomized trials. And I think we could make use of these at all levels, both for their own sake, but also to promote health and healing. Likewise, I think forgiveness can be promoted at local, national, and international scales. Large empirical literature, a fair bit of which is experimental in nature, indicating that forgiveness improves certainly mental health, lowers depression, anxiety, improves various aspects of flourishing. We've carried out a human flourishing program, a large randomized trial of about 4,500 participants in 5 high-conflict countries, finding these effects using simply a self-directed forgiveness workbook that distills about 30 years of work in clinical psychology on forgiveness to a workbook format. So I think this could be promoted more generally, and we've recently launched a global forgiveness movement at the Human Flourishing Program to try to do so. I think love should also be promoted at local, national, and international scales. Love, again, is central to Christian understanding of well-being, but increasing empirical evidence, which we've also documented, that this promotes physical and mental health as well. And really, I do think love needs to be promoted if we are to try to ensure what the World Health Organization claims as a right to the highest attainable standard of health. If that's to be upheld as best as possible, and that health, as the World Health Organization understands it, is complete physical, social, mental, and social well-being, then there's no way to bring about that complete social well-being without love. So I think, yes, we need to promote justice, but we're only going to uphold this right as best as possible if we also promote love. Next, in the context of a pluralistic society, I think there should be open dialogue concerning how different communities understand health and wholeness and flourishing, and what is ultimately most important. Notions of evangelism or apostolate or proselytization are often viewed with very negative connotations. But if this is framed in terms of flourishing, well-being, our understanding of what is most important, I think we should be talking about these things with one another, and what we do understand as our ultimate end, and different notions of spiritual well-being. And therefore, I do think religious individuals and communities should be free to pursue their ultimate goals and ends in promoting the health of the body, but also the health and the healing of persons as well. So that's kind of a big high-level summary. Happy to take comments and questions, but thank you all for listening and for the invitation to be here today.
Thanks very much, Tyler. That was a very clear and broad-ranging presentation. And I feel that working in the Catholic health sector, what you provided us with is a very rich framework for understanding the kind of enterprise we're engaged in. The other thing I would say just briefly is that all of those dot points that you put up on your slides, particularly in the implications section, having worked with you, I know that there's many publications that attach to each of those dot points. So I thought that would just be worth stating to the audience that this is, in a certain sense, you may not get the full picture of the breadth of research that's gone into this project, but I really do think when you look at all the evidence, it's a very impressive piece of work, Tyler. So thanks so much for presenting today. And we're going to take a few questions. Just first off, I thought I'd go to Matthew Lennon's question, which was, he's from the University of New South Wales, works as a psychiatrist. Thank you for a brilliant talk, Tyler. I've nearly finished my training in psychiatry. Given that you think psychiatry could engage in all aspects of flourishing, would you say that it is the highest form of medicine? Is psychiatry the highest form of medicine? What do you think?
My view would be that each of the caring professions has a particular and important role, and I do think the role of a counselor and in principle a psychiatrist, if there's alignment on understandings of flourishing, are essentially the broadest, addressing the most aspects of the broadest range of aspects of a person's life. However, I'd be hesitant to say it is the highest insofar as, again, because of that breadth, there is the specialization necessary to address certain aspects. There is the specialization perhaps to address mental health, but not the health of the body in the same way. Not the broken arm or cardiovascular disease. And so I do think we need each of the caring professions, and that each have a critical, important role.
Thanks very much. So this is from Matthew Iesello from the University of Adelaide. Thank you, Tyler, for your talk. To what degree does the ideal of help overlap with concepts of theosis or deification?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say that the complete and final health of the person, our final eternal flourishing, and what we're ultimately as Christians aiming at, is understood in parts of the Christian tradition as theosis, and other parts as the beatific vision. But I do think that's what referred to in the book as kind of eternal flourishing. That's what we're as Christians ultimately aiming at. So yes, part of flourishing, not something we attain fully here, but what we are aiming at, and that spiritual well-being in this life, in a sense, is that directing the whole of life to that final end.
This one's from Dr. Sanwa Siraj, who's working as a postdoc at the University of Hong Kong and is currently a visiting researcher at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown. He asks, I focus on research on the implications of religious ethics and law of end-of-life care decisions, such as medical assistance in dying. If I understand your argument properly today, that illness is part of God's divine plan and we should treat patients properly, how can we then address untreatable patients, many of whom are willing to make decisions to end their lives? So I don't know, Tyler, if you have any thoughts on how we might think about this problem of untreatable pain, suffering, and how a holistic account of health might help in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think to my mind, the caregiving questions are difficult, but more straightforward than the legal ones. And while I do think that intentionally ending a patient's life with that as an end is wrong and is contrary to God's intent, and I think a perfectly just society would not allow that. I do think it is more complicated in the context of a pluralistic society, and how to navigate countries' laws when there are different understandings of right and wrong is difficult. But in the caregiving context, I think pointing towards a fuller understanding of the health of the person, of flourishing, to acknowledge that flourishing is multidimensional, and some things can be going well even when other things are not, so that even in cases of incurable illness, or even when death within the next 6 months is imminent, that the human person is more than just the body, that there can be a sense of meaning and making sense of life, that those relationships can still be important and valuable, that there can be a sense of growth and development, even in working through pain, struggles, suffering, and that itself is part of a person's flourishing. And that, again, from a Christian perspective, that it can also lead to a deeper connection with God, a deeper spiritual well-being, and that life itself is God's gift, and that we are to make use of it to try to, again, orient ourselves to that final end. But I think even outside of a Christian understanding, talking about those matters of meaning, of relationships, of growth, can help orient someone away from requesting death. And in the paper I'd mentioned earlier that Xavier and I and others had written on flourishing at the end of life, we touch on some of these matters at the end. The paper is broader than that, and it's more about care at the end of life rather than just these questions of early termination of life. But I do think that broader understanding of the health of the person, the flourishing of the person, that this is multidimensional, can be helpful in caregiving.
Right, and I think that's just answered a question which we had from Mary L, which was about the how do we as Catholic Christians understand the suffering of and meaning of serious and painful illness and otherwise good, well-balanced people of faith. So I think you've kind of touched a little bit on the meaning of suffering. I don't know if you wanted to say anything further on that.
I mean, there's a more in the book than I've been able to comment on, and I do think it is one of the real struggles with Christian faith, both at the intellectual level, but then also often at the personal existential level. Why would God allow this sort of suffering to occur? And I do think there can be growth within suffering. I think there are always opportunities to find God, to find new meaning in the midst of suffering. But often that's hard in the moment and the experience of suffering. I do think that suffering, as I said, always makes clear our own brokenness and our need for God. So I mean, one has to proceed carefully and pastorally in the face of suffering, but I think pointing sometimes to those opportunities of growth, and then ultimately pointing to, from the Christian perspective, in the context of Christian patient care, towards Christ's sufferings, towards Christ's taking our sufferings upon himself. I think there's a complex relationship between suffering and flourishing. Not long ago, a Jewish colleague asked me, Tyler, was Christ flourishing on the cross? And I immediately responded yes, and then thought, what does that mean? And I think this comes back in some sense to that definition of flourishing as all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context, communities, environments in which that person lives, so that the community's well-being is part of one's own flourishing. And I think understood in that way, from a Christian perspective, what Christ was accomplishing on the cross, that salvation of the world, the contribution to the world was so substantial, unfathomable. That contribution was part of Christ's own flourishing. So while the suffering was terrible, so was the flourishing. And I think this can sometimes, not always, but help make sense of our own experiences of suffering, voluntarily taking on suffering for the sake of some cause, for helping others. Yes, at one level it seems like we're flourishing, yes, but if that contribution we are making is seen as part of our own flourishing, then we can flourish in the midst of suffering. It may be more difficult in the context of patient care, but kind of faithful witness and attempting to seek God, to seek growth in the midst of difficulty and trial can be a powerful witness, can make a powerful contribution to the lives of others, and I think provide, in some instances at least, a way to find flourishing even in the midst of suffering.
Great. We're just about at time. I mean, maybe we can take one more question, perhaps. And sorry if you
Yep,
posted a question and we're
happy.
going to miss it. So while I'm at it, Lai Ying from Catholic Healthcare here in Australia she's a spiritual and pastoral care worker. She says that flourishing in today's secular world is acknowledging that the wholeness of an individual includes religious traditions and rituals. Thank you, because we do approach with this lens when I care for any individual of all religions and traditions. So I think Lai Ying is saying thanks very much for kind of giving a framework to reinforce the work that she's engaged in. And then I've got a question here from bioethicist Elliot Bedford, which is, can you elaborate more on the way that introducing sin as a concept within the conversation around health and public health limits or sets conditions of what we can hope to achieve? It seems to me the first implication is that it eliminates any utopian vision or urge within public health and health studies.
Yeah. So I guess on the first comment, yeah, I mean, I do think even in the pluralistic context, the way to argue for inclusion of spiritual well-being is simply to point out that even in a more secular or pluralistic society, many people hold this as their most important value, and so we should be taking this into account. That's different from saying everyone must, focus on spiritual well-being, and in our, program's core flourishing measure, we don't have a spiritual well-being assessment, in part because not everyone considers this important, and also in part because that understanding is going to differ across religious traditions. But in terms of arguing for space for this, either in clinical care or in policy context, I think simply pointing out, look, so many people view this as valuable, and often their highest value. We should be attentive to it. With regard to sin, again, the principal audience for this book was Christians engaged in public health, medicine, or reflection on healthcare, though, as stated in the preface of the book, also hoped to have some reach to Christians everywhere, and also to those in health or healthcare that don't come from a Christian perspective. And while I do think human wrongdoing we understand in the Christian context at a deeper theological level as sin, I wouldn't necessarily propose going around in secular public health contexts using those concepts and that language. But I do think, an intermediate way, which was there in the proposition, some propositions, is to talk about wrongdoing. I think there's a lot of hesitation, even in the public health community, about using that word, not just sin, but that word as well. But I think when we start talking about particular instances like violence or discrimination, many will say, no, that, I agree, that is wrong, that there's a moral dimension to this. And I think doing that, again, opens the door to talk about matters of character and formation, and how do we help people to avoid wrongdoing? How do we create a society where there is greater love and care, as well as moving discussion towards matters of moral injury as well. So what I'd probably propose, in the context of public health and public policy, is not the notion of trying to introduce the notion of sin, but the notion of wrongdoing, being clear about the moral dimensions of actions that do give rise to ill health. And I think we could go a lot farther than we have at present, again, even in a pluralistic context. And I do think that doing so would open new doors in public health and public policy.
Thanks very much, Tyler. I think at this point we might call it a day. This has been a very rich discussion. There are quite a few questions in the chat, which is great to see so much interest from the audience. But I do think that people either need to go home or start work. So I think we probably better keep to time here. And I'd just like to take this opportunity again to thank you for a fantastic presentation. It's a real honor to have you present to the Plunkett Center, and also to collaborate as well with the De Nicola Center. And great to see such a global audience tune in today. So please do Stay up to date, everyone, with our work and events, and we have a newsletter which you can sign up to via our website, and also you may have already opted into that when you registered, so hopefully we can stay in touch. But in any case, we hope that you've enjoyed today's webinar, and thanks very much for joining us. Have a good day or a good evening.